The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club with Vivian Deirdre, Father Fessio, Joseph Pierce. We're discussing the drama of Atheist Humanism by Henri de Lubac, and we left off on page 364. And I have something I want to quote at the bottom, but Joseph advances me, trumps me. Go ahead, Joseph.
So yes, I obviously on page 364 we have some things here which will play into nationalism in both a good and bad sense. So we have Shatov immediately protest. This is the second paragraph, or the first full paragraph on that page, third of the way down. So I reduce God to no more than an attribute of the people. On the contrary, I raise the people to the level of God. The people are the body of God, end quote. But this explanation strengthens rather than modifies the theory. Quote, a nation remains a nation only so long as it has its particular God and fiercely disapproves of all the other gods there are, so long as it believes that with its God it will be able to conquer, subjugate, and drive out all the other gods. And then skip a few more lines to the end of that paragraph. A great nation is one that believes that it is the sole repository of the truth, that it is the only one called and the only one capable of resuscitating and saving the world by its particular truth. As soon as it ceases to believe that, it is done for. So I just wanted to comment upon that, because this is obviously something which we see is true of the notion of Holy Mother Russia, but it was also true of the Pax Britannica, right? The British Empire, that the British were the civilized people, and wherever the Union Jack was raised and civilization was arriving. Prior to that, you can the Pax Romana, and there's Adolf Hitler with the Third Reich and the Thousand-Year Reich, and even a certain type of, should we say, neoconservatism in Graham Greene's novel, The Quiet American. There's a character in that who's a member of the CIA and is absolutely convinced in the messianic sense that exporting the American dream to Vietnam, or French Indochina as it is when the novel's being set, is the answer to the world's problems. And of course, we can know there are problems attached to that as well. So I think there's something that's very apt and appropriate to Russia, which is obviously our topic of conversation. We're talking about Dostoyevsky, but I think it's applicable to my own country, by which I mean the UK, and also to America, as well as other countries.
Well, in what you read at the end, a great nation is one that believes it is the sole repository of the truth, that is the only one called, the only one capable of resuscitating and saving the world by its particular truth. And I thought, well, that sounds so ridiculous, doesn't it, when you read it? And yet, as you just said, the Pax Romana, the Pax Britannica, the Third Reich, and Pax Americana, there's certainly, it may not be as bald and as bold and as crude as that, but there's this idea that we want to export democracy for a rules-based international order. And I say we, the narrative, Americans, many people, they think that that's true, that we have an obligation out of charity maybe to bring democracy to the world because we think it's the final stage and the best stage.
Well, going back to, I think the question that de Lubac is answering is when the Mother Russia view comes out of the mouths of the different characters in his novels, and this one here, this Shatov, he's in The Possessed, but it comes out in other novels by Dostoyevsky. And the question de Lubac is raising is, how much of this is Dostoyevsky? And he does, go into some length about how all of his characters are a little bit Dostoyevsky and a little, so to discern how much of this is Dostoyevsky. So I consulted my family Russian expert to find out about...
Which is her son, who's a Marine who speaks Russian and has studied Russian history.
Yeah. And
been there.
And is following the Russian situation. And so he gave me some interesting insights. He says that this idea that Russia was almost called by God to save Christianity goes all the way back to the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Turks, because since the schism between East and West had already occurred in the 11th century, what Russia witnessed of the Western Church was not really that flattering. For example, the Avignon papacy, where the popes were in France from 1309 to 1377, completely under the control of the French monarch. Then, even after that, we had the 3 popes at one time, all contending for the papacy, and that didn't end until 1417. And so, from the Russian point of view, Western Christianity was actually already over. They saw European Western Christianity as utterly debauched, under the control of temporal powers, and that the church was actually using temporal power to continue to extend its influence. Now, my son said that from a Russian point of view, this actually even became an existential issue because of all the wars at the borders between Russia and the West. We talked earlier about the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth. Prior to that, there were the Teutonic Knights. So this war at the, what for Russia would be the Western border, and for Western Europe, the Eastern border, this warfare going back and forth over centuries made Russia feel that this decayed Western European Catholicism was not only a national threat, it was an existential threat. And so this mentality has continued all the way to the present day. And my son says, and from a Russian's point of view, it's perfectly understandable that they feel the way they do, but you have to understand that they're absolutely antagonistic to any Roman Catholicism at all, because in their minds, Rome fell a long time ago. And in fact, Ivan I took notes for my son, Ivan III, when Constantinople fell in 1453, the Tsar Ivan III said, now it's up to Moscow to become the third Rome. So the first Rome being Rome, the second Rome, Constantinople, Moscow now was to become the third Rome and the preserver of Christianity for the world. Now, by the time we get to Dostoyevsky, how much of this was part of his psyche? How much of this? A lot, actually. And de Lubac mentions on page, the top of page 369, he mentions just very briefly, the very top line, famous address in commemoration of Pushkin. Okay, the famous Russian poet. This speech, I actually looked it up and I read about it in this biography of Dostoevsky I read years ago. This is where, from the Russian point of view, Dostoevsky became literally a prophet, because he was lionizing Pushkin the poet, but also calling from Russia its saving mission to save Christianity. And he was so passionate about it that the crowd was completely in a swoon over this speech. This was just less than a year before Dostoevsky died. And it was while he was writing The Brothers Karamazov. I didn't realize this. The Brothers Karamazov were published serially in a literary periodical that Dostoevsky edited, not unlike Dickens, right? No wonder these are so long, these Russian novels and these Dickens novels. In any case, this was so dear to Dostoevsky's heart. Now, and he was utterly convinced that Roman Catholicism was irredeemable, unfixable. But what's different between Dostoevsky and perhaps other Russian leaders, whether cultural or political, is that Dostoevsky was so adamant that this could not be brought about by force. Although he had no problem with fighting the Turks by force, I don't think he envisioned warfare between Christians as being a violent. He really thought that the Russian people were so pure precisely because they were poor. He had this kind of romanticization, of the faithful poor and that.
Tolstoy too, yeah.
And Tolstoy actually became a peasant himself. I mean, tried to be. So there was this in the Russian psyche, and it is part of Dostoyevsky. I think what's so interesting now, what de Lubac does with this, is on page 368 in the middle, de Lubac says, there is doubt that Shatov incarnates a tendency that was very strong in Dostoevsky. He believed in Russia as a people bearing God, meaning Dostoevsky, and almost as God himself. He did not doubt that Russian thought had the mission of regenerating the world. His messianic orthodoxy, tending to merge with the pan-Slav idea, became more and more fervent during his later years. And that is the reason why his voice took such a tone in the famous address, which I already described, in commemoration of Pushkin. But now, what de Lubac does with this final set of quotes from Dostoevsky, I think de Lubac is saying, yes, but because Dostoevsky believes so much in freedom, there's a reality of human nature and the greatest gift that God gave to man, apart from his reason. So here de Lubac says, nevertheless, he, meaning Dostoevsky, was no dupe. In Shatov's position, there is something that is not clear, and Dostoevsky leads his hero to an embarrassed confession of it. The interview with Stavrogin ends in defeat. And then there's quotes here from the interview where we have Shatov not even sure he believes in God. You can actually have this, oh yes, I believe in Russia, I believe in orthodoxy, but what God has to do with it, I'm not so sure.
Joseph, you did a lot of work on Solzhenitsyn. To what extent would you see in Solzhenitsyn, echoes of or correspondences with this idea of Russia as the Christian messianic country?
Well, I think there's an element of that, and I think and I thank you very much, Vivian, for that very good explication. The other aspect of Dostoevsky, and this is also true of Solzhenitsyn, is that there's a struggle with also the Enlightenment, which they also would have seen as a Western problem, right? So Solzhenitsyn was, I think, he would be somewhat more moderate. And again, as Vivian has pointed out here, particularly this exchange here, if the nation becomes God, that do you believe in God, right? That I think that Solzhenitsyn's experience in the West broadened and softened him and mellowed him. As I said a few weeks ago, that he said, I see Russia as part of the West, as part of Christendom, as part of Western civilization. And he said that if the Iron Curtain had come down and the cream of Western civilization had seeped over the top, I would have rejoiced. And when I asked him directly about St. John Paul II's role in bringing down communism via solidarity, trade union, etc., he was absolutely emphatic that he played a crucial role in that. He did, however, raise the issue of the Catholic Church negotiating with the Bolsheviks immediately after the Russian Revolution to try to get an inroad into Russia now that the Orthodox Church is being suppressed by the Bolsheviks. And so, in other words, he's still very angry by what he saw as the Catholic Church's betrayal of the Russian people following the Bolshevik Revolution. And then when he met St. John Paul II, he actually raised that with him. So that's how strongly he felt about it. But I think that because he actually, it's what I feel coming over here. But before I came to America, I only saw America from the outside. And my view of the USA was based upon an outsider's view of it. And in some sense, you have to come here and see it from the inside to understand it better. And I still know what it looks like from the outside because I've had that perspective. And I think Solzhenitsyn had exactly the same thing, that in being exiled from the Soviet Union and spending so much time, first of all, in Switzerland and then for most of the time in Vermont in the United States, he came to understand the West. He took that understanding of the West back to Russia with him. And although he made a great Slavophile, a love of his own people and culture, he, if you like, was a mellowing, I would say, moderating influence upon Russian conservative thought because of his knowledge of the West.
Well, and there's a mirror image of this. Our knowledge of Russia is from the outside too.
Mm-hmm.
And this book and the book precisely help us to get an understanding of what it looks like from inside Russia. Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, Vivian, these skirmishes on the borders of Russia between West and East in that sense were always existential. Mm-hmm. What's the Russian word for borderland? Ukraine. That's what Ukraine means, borderlands. Mm-hmm. That's the existential area for Russia. And that's why, to bring this to the contemporary thing, why we may see no problem in extending NATO as far east as we can. For Russia, from inside Russia, that's aggression, and they've said it for decades.
Now, my son, though, will point out that the situation in Ukraine, what makes it doubly complicated is that you have both peoples. The Ukrainians who self-identify as Ukrainians do not consider themselves Russians. The Russians, though, also live in Ukraine. And so the Russians who live there
and their citizens
want to be part of Russia, and the Ukrainians who live there don't. And so part of this is a civil war between these two sets of peoples, and they are distinct peoples. My son has said that this idea that no, somehow all these people are part of Mother Russia. Look, Kiev became Christian in 899, before the schism between East and West. At that time, Moscow was a swamp. It was nothing. Those people were nothing. And so
we have to be careful. There's been an awful lot of migration of peoples in what is now Russia.
Yes, now
the Russians would certainly say,
when I was in Kiev,
I'm talking about 899, what Moscow was in 899.
Yes, the Russian people weren't living in Moscow and weren't based in Moscow then. They were further south. So that say that the Russians, all these tribal people lived in swamps and then somehow or other, caught up. No, there's been a lot of migration of the Russian people around in what is in Russia, and that, including the Ukraine.
Yes.
And again, that civil war, it is a civil war, and I'm not arguing with that.
Yes.
But it's not a very complicated civil war, because the majority of the people in the eastern part of the Ukraine are Russians. The majority of people in the western part of Ukraine are Ukrainians. I mean, obviously, it's a bit more mixed up than that. There's Hungarians there and Romanians there as well. But so the point is that there's two separate areas that call themselves Ukraine that are like this with each other. That's the problem.
That's right. And your point about the migration of peoples is very well taken, and it's not just ethnic Russians involved. There are, I don't remember the number, but the number of ethnicities of people living in these lands is huge, and language groups and all the rest. And so my son, when people ask him point blank, so is Putin a Russian nationalist? And he'll say, well, that depends. Or is he an imperialist? Well, that depends. And this is a tricky thing for Putin politically as well. If he can manage to keep all these disparate peoples together, all equal under law and so forth, without favoring one minority and this kind of thing, that's one thing. And remains to be seen, is that what's being undertaken or not? If, though, what were to emerge would be an ethnocentric sort of Russian imperialism or nationalism, that would bode that would bode ill not only for people who call themselves Ukrainians, but all these other ethnic groups who are spread throughout these lands. So
can I say to that, just to speak to that, is another wonderful thing that Solzhenitsyn said. So Solzhenitsyn was facing aggressive questioning from some liberal Western journalist. And he's accused of being a Slavophile, and he said, "Why? I do love my country. I love Russia." And then, because of the fact that Russia is a multi-ethnic society, this journalist said, "Well, who exactly is Russian?"
Yeah.
Right. And Solzhenitsyn responded, "Anybody who feels Russian."
Oh,
In other words, it's not about race, it's not about ethnicity, it's about, do you actually adhere to the common understanding of what it is to be a Russian? If you do, irrespective of what your ethnicity is, you are Russian.
Well, and I mean, this is probably different now. When I was in Russia in the late 90s, I was in Novosibirsk, in south of Novosibirsk, in this area which was populated by Germans under Catherine the Great, who
was Austrian.
it was Austrian, yeah. And these people showed me their passports. It said Nimitz on it, German. This is not Moscow or St. Petersburg. This is Siberia. I mean, this is Novosibirsk, and they still consider themselves as German even 2 centuries after this took place.
Yeah.
My second experience, a different trip, but I was in Kiev, and I think I might have mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. They've got this underground monastery there, where the monks lived underground for their whole lives. They never left their cells, and their cells were like these little caves. It was kind of a common corridor and a cave with bars, and they lived there the whole time.
Wow.
And I mean, talk about asceticism. Anyway, there was this Ukrainian guide who was taking us through there, and somehow the discussion went about the Moscow Patriarchate and the Ukrainian Autocephalic Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And she said the same thing. One of you said, you said, we were Christian when Moscow was a swamp.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Those very words.
That's what they say. Yeah. So yeah, but Moscow became with the incursion of the Turks, and then this borderland dispute going on. That's how Moscow gained in importance, because the Romanovs, the dynasty, I think this Ivan III was one of the first Romanovs. Anyway, they managed to fight off these other threats, and that's how Moscow became so important, because it was from there they're fighting off threats on all sides. And the people who what do you want to call it, don't take seriously the claim that for Russia this is existential. My son will say, you just don't know Russian history then, because for them it has always been existential. They've been fighting all these different aggressive groups.
During World War II, when the Nazis basically broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and instead of being allies to the Soviet Union, then attacked the Soviet Union, that Stalin dropped immediately all pretense of Marxist propaganda and started speaking about Holy Mother Russia, because he knew that's exactly what would get the people behind the Red Army, behind the Soviet Army, to fight the Germans. It was actually, he had to become a Christian, symbolically, in order to actually get the Russians to fight the Nazis.
And that was in a previous session, I mentioned that film, Alexander Nevsky, I think it's Nevsky, who fought the Teutonic Knights. That film was made under Stalin's regime to gear up the Russian people for a German advance and to be prepared to fight to the death against it. And so, this has a long, long history.
I mean, the Russians are not going to die for Karl Marx, right?
No.
And a century before that, of course, Napoleon goes in. A century before that was Sweden that actually invaded Russia through Ukraine.
Prussians. This has been an ongoing thing. So it's simple and complicated at the same time, I guess. So
I think this is very helpful, though, because I think that when they're in time of warfare, which obviously in that part of the world we are now, it's all very too simple to just go into a knee-jerk binary position, so to speak, right? Where it's black and white. And one side's demonic and the other side's heroic, and we don't have to think about any nuance or what motivates the one side. No, they're just demons, right? One side's orcs and the other side are hobbits. So very, very easy then, but that's not the way it is. And so I think this has been very important.
Good.
So
back to Dostoyevsky. I just want to end this quote at the bottom of page 369 to sum up this Messianic Russian thing. Lubach here is saying Dostoyevsky does not confuse nationalism, even of a mystical and spiritual type, with faith. I think that is the key point that de Lubac is making in this section.
Yeah, and the danger is summed up at where we started with the end of the previous section, where people make of nationhood and nationality an idol.
Yes.
Now, once the nation becomes an idol, it becomes a god. If it becomes a god, it's immediately ipso facto a rival to God Himself, and it's
right.
that's the
I
danger.
wanted to start this session with a quote from page 264, but this has been a very interesting excursus. Thomas, do we have time for?
Yeah, you do. You got about 5 minutes.
All right. So now I want to read this quote in light of what we just said, because bottom of page 364, second paragraph from the end there. During the last 50 years, we've had more than one description of mystical imperialism. Is not Chateau its forerunner? Today, there's much talk of realism. Did not Chateau again observe that it's impossible to go against facts? Okay, what does that mean? A philosophy of history can be built up on that foundation. Here's historical, ductus here. The Jews were a great nation because all they lived for was to await the coming of the true God and give him to the world. The Greeks deified nature and bequeathed to the world their religion, that is to say, their philosophy and their art. Rome defined the people in the form of the state. France was the incarnation of Roman Catholicism, and she is now propagating an atheist socialism that is its natural sequel. When he comes to Russia, Shatov ingeniously rediscovers the only God, and the universalism of conquest that for him is the mark of great nations is found to coincide with the universalism of truth and of the absolute. Quote, this is Shatov. As there is only one truth, there cannot be more than one single nation that possesses a true God, however great and mighty the gods of the other nations may be. The only people bearing God is the Russian people. So that's Shatov.
And now we know why Russians can feel that way.
And then continuing, thus after Kirillov, after Prince Mishkin, and after Maria Timofeevna, Shatov too has his religion. But what sort of a deity is this, which at one moment seems to be no more than man, at another takes on the aspect of life, the earth, or the nation? In what immanent power, capital P, can we recognize God? If that is what Dostoyevsky offers us after having conquered atheism, are we to rejoice in his victory? He has plumbed the depths of our flesh and blood nature, and he has wonderfully exalted the sense of holiness. But is it not a decidedly ambiguous holiness? There's
Yes. As Joseph just said, if you turn your nation into God, what kind of holiness will that be? What will you not be willing to do to your enemies once you've made the nation God?
Yep.
On page 366, this has to do with the idea of these characters being kind of parts or fragments of Dostoevsky. A new paragraph there. Foregoing are truisms, but here the difficulty begins. What is the ego? I have in mind me, my nature, my temperament, my character, containing elements some of which I proscribe, some of which I ratify, and some of which I endure. There are the characteristics I've inherited and those I have made for myself. There are these things are the things that I hide from myself and the things for which I yearn without possessing them, but which are a molding influence because they attract me. So he's pointing out here that, well, what do you mean fragments of this? We don't even know ourselves. I mean, there's dark corners, there's bright corners, there's ambiguities in there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually quite a good, I don't know, it's not a definition of the ego, but I think it's a good description of the various facets of the ego, which I think is very useful. And of course, it shows the necessity of the ego getting outside itself so that it doesn't become self-obsessive.
And I think of John Paul II saying, man is a mystery to himself.
And I want to quote from these two letters to Maikov. This is Dostoevsky, not fiction. This is his writing letters. This is on page 368 in the footnotes, footnote 33. Things are moving toward regeneration for the whole world through Russian thought, which, as you rightly remark, is firmly wedded to orthodoxy, and it will come within the next 100 years. So he's predicting that Russian thought is going to regenerate the world. 34. The horizon of Russia's future is widening. The principle has been established of a whole new world in which Christianity will find renewal at the hands of pan-Slav orthodoxy, and mankind will be presented with a new system of thought. This will come to pass when the West has gone rotten, and the West will go rotten when the Pope, having finally distorted Christ, has by that very fact stirred up atheism in the corrupt humanity of the West. That's it.
Now the Russians, for the most part, pretty much already believed that the West was already hopelessly corrupt, that Roman Catholicism had proved its moral bankruptcy by getting into bed with monarchs and princes, and and that they were perfectly willing to use force to compel faith. This was their view of Roman Catholicism. Now, when you think of the Russian despotic czars, you're kind of wondering, how does Dostoyevsky have such a hopeful view that resurgent Russia isn't going to be just as tyrannical with the use of authority as everybody else has proved to be? And in fact, what happens after his death is the Bolshevik takeover of Russia and the imposition, a new system of thought, Russian messianism wedded with worldwide communist revolution. That is just such a strange turn of events compared to what he was expecting.
I would say there, Vivian, I don't think it's Russian messianism. It's Western corruption embraced by a certain intellectual class in Russia to embrace a globalist international revolution, which is not very far from the Russian ideal of things. But I think the bigger problem is that what he's saying there in those footnotes, he's really making of Russia the true religion. He's really actually doing what he says through his novels people should not do, because you're making a god of your nation. The thing about the Catholic Church, for all of its weaknesses, it is universal, right? It has got in bed with France at certain times, such as the Avignon papacy, etc., and it's been disastrous when it's done it. But generally speaking, the Catholic Church does not belong to any one nation. And that's one of the beauties of it, right? Is that no one nation can put their thumb or their jackboot on the Catholic Church, at least not for long and not successfully.
And that's one of the weaknesses. And that's one of the weaknesses of Orthodoxy, that after the Great Schism in 1054, the Orthodox churches were autocephalous churches. And so how could they not take on the national ethnic character of their locations? Because there no longer was a sign of unity that the papacy is supposed to be. And so when you think about the tremendous missionary impetus of the Roman Catholic Church throughout the world, into Asia and Latin America, and the genius, so much of the true enculturation, not the phony counterfeits form of it, but the true enculturation, that somehow this faith could take root in every culture, in every people, and they don't have to become Europeans to become Christians, even though certain things about that culture came across, of course. But this was the beauty of Catholicism.
Is.
Amen.
I want to say one more thing about Dostoyevsky's prophet, because in many ways he is prophetic. There's no question about that. But this is in 1870s, 1869. He's writing these letters in 1868, and his prophecy there is because the Pope of the West is distorted Christ. Atheism will corrupt society.
Yes.
And Russia will save it. What happened 50 years later? Russia became atheist. The West was saved from atheism, really by Christian Europe and by the United States. Although now we have a decline into a different kind of atheism, a practical atheism taking place. But in any event, his prophecy for the next 100 years was exactly diametrically wrong from what actually happened.
And yet,
always dangerous to play the prophet, right, Father?
And yet the thing he got at, the essence of the thing he got at, was when Christians betray their faith to worship some idol, which is either the state or science or progress or even absolute freedom or whatever. When Christians lose their sense that they are sons of God, surrendered to his will for the good of themselves and everyone, when they lose that and turn to something else, then the things that he predicts do in fact happen. The church does become corrupt. And then thank God, though, God raises up saints and raises up holiness in surprising places to renew the church, always has, and we pray always will, right? And there you have it. I think the essence of what Dostoyevsky put his finger on is still true, even though the way it worked itself out in human history is not exactly what he was expecting.
Well, as obviously we've overstayed our welcome here, so to speak, in terms of time. I'm going to, if I may, end on a patriotic note as we're talking about nationalism here with an English.
We've covered 5 pages. I think that was very useful. And we'll join you in the next session next week to continue, perhaps even more than 5 pages. So God bless you all.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumedbookclub.ignatius.com.